Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the final chapter of Research to Rescue. This will be Part 9, Chapter 9, entitled, There's a Time in One's Life When They Gotta Flip Shit. Today is not that day, sadly. The Fallout was a messy place to be lost in. There were many sides to it, yes, and the worst place in that mix was the dead center, and that was where Aizawa was at the moment. It was the place he desperately wanted to not be. Tensei had everything explained to him, the mole, the rabbit, whatever Tsukauchi was able to tell him, it was said. It was tedious almost, and somewhat strange to see a long-time friend of his look so angry with him after. And the lecture Aizawa got was just as scathing as his eyes, but not worse than watching the hero storm out and hearing the door slam behind him. In the spare time between figuring out what would happen with Izuku and waiting for him to wake up, Aizawa took the time to go over his students' finals, the ones he missed in December, marking the first absent days in his teaching career, putting in his commentary and notes on their future improvements, if not for them to read, for their future instructors. Asking for the scores meant going into the school which was currently making sure things were on track for the students, new and old, the building improvements, the resources for the support students, making sure all the other areas were safe for student training, and planning the first year's entrance tests, though they were the same every year. Going to the school meant seeing his coworkers, the same coworkers who had seen a very anxious Aizawa while waiting for the raids to start, who had been missing without a damn word and leftover other heroes had to pick up his patrols for the last 3 months, who had a copycat villain out there during that time. In short, Aizawa did not want to talk to them just yet. Nezu knew everything, and the basics of the raid were common knowledge between those who participated. But questions were questions, and if anyone had questions, it would be midnight. Nomuri was allowed to be curious. Aizawa had a 3-month-long secret absence and showed up for a big mission from out of the blue. She watched Hizashi be paranoid about him, but not about cheating, as he had said. She was chasing for a real answer, like their coworkers did. Nomuri was pulled aside, and Aizawa gave her that answer. He was cleared, by both his boss and the detective, to inform people who needed to know. And Nomuri was on the need to know if the future was to work as he suspected, at least. A SparkNote version, trying to be as short and unbiased as possible, given quietly in a factual tone. Throughout the explanation, Aizawa found it somewhat hard to gauge her expressions. She left the hallway in silence, probably to figure out how she should feel about all this, and villains had been taken down, but it was how that seemed to have caught her. Nezu was the only other problem in the workspace. He had insisted to be kept up to date while Aizawa's mission was in progress. He was given what Tsukauchi was able to give, and not much more. And after the raids and Izuku was in a safe place for recovery, Tsukauchi gave the principal a more in-depth explanation of the events. Since then, he'd been quiet. Too quiet. The silence was unappreciated, and at this point it was more annoying than anything else. Aizawa had 2 things he needed to do now. One of those was to visit Izuku to wait for the kid to wake up, just to make sure he was all right when he woke up, and to have a word about his actions after the backpack, but mostly to give assurance to both sides. Aizawa would know the kid was alive, and Izuku would have a familiar face to start off a rather tough section of his life, which was being free from that coward of a father and going into a period of readjustment. The other thing was the Yagis. It had been 3 whole days since the raids, and even though they were allowed back into their apartment, they had yet to be informed of what was going on beyond that they were safe now. Tsukauchi and Aizawa were the ones to talk to them, or the ones told to do so at least. Tsukauchi as their friend and the head of the entire thing, and Aizawa as the person who knew more firsthand. He was the one who knew the most about the subject of this conversation, even though it wasn't all that much to start with. They were to tell them about Izuku, now that the kid was definitely in a safe place recovering, and about Izuku's past actions. Inko was the mother. She was the person who deserved to know the most. So there they were, at a dining table in a small apartment with tea sitting before each of them. It wasn't scalding hot, but it wasn't lukewarm. It didn't taste bad, either, though Aizawa definitely preferred coffee. Now he was mentally stalling this conversation. He looked up at his blonde friend, 2 years his senior, and now halfway through the process of becoming a withering skeleton. Beside him was Inko, who looked more nervous and apprehensive than her husband. With the comparison there, Aizawa saw how Izuku and Inko were related, the hair, the eyes, and almost the same features. Hers were softer, older, and less cold, Both had a tiredness to their eyes, but Inko's could be because of sleepless nights in the last week. Izuku's, well, his reasons were obvious, weren't they? We wanted to inform you about what happened a few days ago. We were able to release more information about what exactly happened to certain parties, and you both are very high on that list. Tsukauchi started with an official tone. First and foremost, we had taken both of you into custody as a precaution to a threat overheard soon before. It was mainly protection, and yes, Toshinori, I know you were more than capable of protecting both of you, but the situation was more than All Might could handle. Tsukauchi added before Toshinori could get any input in. Aizawa was the one who heard the threat, thus why he's here to explain. Eyes fell on him. Aizawa went over the mental script that he'd been preparing for just this situation. But was there really any good way to tell a worried mother about her ex-husband and missing son? No, but he'd have to do it anyways. I've been undercover in the Silver Dyer group since December. I gathered intel and information mainly from an unknowing informant. In the end, the informant found me out and gave me the information we needed to go through with the raids that happened earlier this week. The Silver Dyer no longer exists as of 2 days ago. Midori Hisashi was detained during the raids and is currently awaiting his trial. Aizawa sighed and held his tea in both hands, and he had a serious look on his face, though it softened after seeing Inko's worry. That informant was the former rabbit assassin, better known as Midori Izuku. The silence after that was heavy. Inko stared, wide-eyed. Toshinori was the same, but Aizawa continued. Izuku expressed that the information he was giving over was a direct danger to you, Inko, and that is why you were brought into protective custody. We were able to locate him after the raids, though there were some complications with his health. He is slated to wake up in the next few days. You found my son. Inko's voice was soft and almost shaking. There were tears in her eyes, though Aizawa was unsure if they were happy or sad. Maybe somewhere between. Aizawa nodded. We have, and I can assure you he's safe, Tsukauchi pressed. His previous situation has been dealt with. Neither of you are in danger anymore. Is this why you were asking about him a few days ago? Toshinori was the one to ask. When I asked about him, he had only just released his name. We had done extensive searches on it, and that led us to both of you. We only wanted information on him, and why he has no trace of any official records after 6 years old. This was only a few hours before he actually handed the larger information to Aizawa. We do have a few conflicting statements that we'd like to clear up. Right. Inko palmed water from her eyes and took a deep breath, holding her teacup in both hands. After a moment, she said in a more stable voice, Right. Well, first, there's no actual record of custody ever belonging to Hisashi after the divorce. There are digital documents, but for legality reasons, paper copies are completed first and then put into the system. Adding to this, the process is not a simple one to go through, so these papers are forgeries and therefore invalid. From past schooling, I understand you have knowledge of legal systems and court laws in Japan, so why did you say Hisashi had custody? Inko's eyebrows furrowed. Guilt sat in them along with her mixture of joy, hopelessness, and sadness. It was the easiest way to keep people from asking questions. I didn't know he faked the papers, though. Questions about? Tsukauchi pressed her. Izuku's sudden disappearance. Why did you not want them asking questions? From what I know about Hisashi, he's been a part of that group since before we were ever married. I found out by accident after Izuku had been born, and he turned violent. Once I knew I had Mitsuki help with the divorce and a restraining order, all I wanted was a safe and normal life for my son. Inko let go of her tea and rolled up the sleeves of her cardigan, showing the ancient burn that had wrapped around the inside of her forearm and crawled upwards, hidden by the rest of her sleeve. It wasn't major, but it wasn't a simple injury either. When Hisashi took Izuku, he made countless threats to my life, to the lives of those I knew, and to Izuku. She rolled the sleeves down and brushed her fingers together. To keep those I care about alive, he said that I shouldn't report any of this to the authorities, to lie, and as much as I disliked it, I followed through. I've seen Silver Dye members around here since Izuku was taken. Hisashi isn't one for empty threats. Aizawa was quiet. So Hisashi had threatened both sides. A child held his mother's life, and the mother held her child's. Assuming Izuku wasn't told about this, Hisashi stuck both of them in corners to play a balancing game. Who fucked up and killed them both first? Bastard really was shitty. Hisashi's threats don't hold anymore. He has zero power where he is, Aizawa assured. What about Izuku? Toshinori asked after glancing at Inko. What about him? What are you going to do with him? I mean, no offense when I say that he's a child, but he's also an assassin. The rabbit. He has a criminal record, isn't the cleanest. What's going to happen to him? There was a restraint in the hero's eyes, and Inko put a hand on his arm with a sort of understanding in her face. Tsukauchi and Aizawa glanced at each other. The detective took his chance to pipe in. There is plenty of evidence to support Izuku during this. He is classified as dangerous, this is correct, but he is still a child, and I've been coordinating with Principal Nezu on a plan of action that doesn't involve jail time. Given a few days' time on this, I can give you more details on what will be happening, should Izuku accept it. Aizawa raised an eyebrow at the officer. Coordinating with Nezu? About what? Aizawa's watch beeped. Time for him to go. He stood up. I'm afraid I have to leave. Thank you for the tea. Inko smiled and thanked him for his hand in all of this, and she walked him to the door. And then he was gone. It was already noon, and if he was going to patrol tonight, he needed to log what was essentially nap time at the house. Now the matter of him actually taking that nap was up in the air. Aizawa walked into the hospital like he had every morning for the last few days, 10 minutes after 6 a.m., walking the hallways to the discreet and unofficial hero ward that had become a vague form of memory. It was more of a less intensive ICU, heroes not in critical but not entirely cleared to be recovered, in a sort of medical limbo. Izuku was moved here since he became stable, but any problems still had nurses running. Those problems being the few times Izuku woken up, not fully conscious and completely unaware of his surroundings, prompting him to panic, speaking in soft but quick words about Inko or Hisashi being angry, which usually led to Aizawa trying to calm him down while stopping the kid's quirk or a nurse administering a temporary sedative. It was at that point that the smoke detectors were disabled in his room, so the smoke wouldn't set off sprinklers in the entire ward, like he had almost 3 times before. Routine was the nurses moving around so the patients were being discharged. The occasional hero that Aizawa knew would greet him before he kept walking on. Routine was the nurse, overlooking a clipboard set on the counter. The only thing off about the routine was the smile she gave him. It was brighter. "Eraserhead," she said while twisting her wrist to look at her watch. "Good to see you're on time." Aizawa nodded and moved to walk past her to Izuku's room, planning to find the plastic seat and wait for an hour before having to leave again. "Oh, right. I'd like to announce your presence before going in. Midori-kun has been on edge since he woke up." Aizawa paused, half turned on his heel to look at the nurse, eyebrows raised. "Woke up? When?" "Around 3:30 this morning. He went back to sleep and woke up about half an hour ago." Aizawa didn't stay to hear what she had said after that because he was already making the turn to head towards the room. He stopped only when he stood in the doorway to see the kid's bed propped up and him staring out the window to the buildings beyond. Relief flooded Aizawa's system. Izuku's eyes were on him, but not even a second after Aizawa appeared on the doorway. Surprised at first, but it was obvious he was somewhat relieved. Wordlessly, Aizawa crossed the room and sat in the plastic chair between the window and the bed, the same chair he'd taken claim of since visitation was allowed. The hero sighed and rolled his shoulders briefly, arms crossed over his chest and leaning back. Silence sat between the two. It wasn't tense, but it wasn't light. Aizawa counted 5 minutes before Izuku broke that silence with a quiet, "Where's my mom?" Aizawa looked at the kid again, bandaged to hell and back, and probably on a shit ton of medications to treat whatever the fuck those bastards did to him. A tired look in his eyes that, by now, wasn't unfamiliar, this time coupled with worry, hands fidgeting in his lap, with his right moving more than his left. "She's safe, like promised." Izuku took a moment to process. When he did, relief was visible on his face as his shoulders relaxed somewhat. The door caught his eyes again. Beyond the half-curtained door were the mundane sounds of everyday life. Among the noise, a woman's high heels clicked on the linoleum in the distant end of the hallway, beeping of machines and the intercom paging a nurse somewhere in the distance. Izuku turned his eyes back to Aizawa and hesitantly asked, "Where am I?" "Musutafu General Hospital in the Hero Ward. It treats heroes that get hurt in the area in dangerous encounters. It's rather far from the base, but it's the safest place for you to recover." Aizawa shifted his shoulders and felt the weight of his capture scarf. What a relief it was to finally have it back. What happened during the raids?" "I don't know what happened to you specifically. I was assigned to handle the floor above you. President Mike is the one to ask about that. He's your rescuer, but Hisashi was captured, along with most of the executives, including Yukio and Kora, across all bases." And the captives? Most of them were rescued. Some are being treated, others had families informed. All of them left the bases. It was no use lying to the kid. Most of the captives in the holding block, as Izuku had called it, were in various states of malnourishment, dehydration, or injury. Some mutated grossly, others on the verge of death, and a few already gone. Judging by the knowing look that passed over his face, Aizawa didn't need to say any of it out loud. More silence. This time Izuku was less tense but still nervous. He was expecting something, but Aizawa didn't know what it was. Maybe it was reprimand for his actions after the park, and that was the exact conversation he'd been waiting to have with the kid anyways. What were you thinking? He didn't sound accusatory or angry. It was flat, like it was when he spoke to his students, asking a rhetorical question, except this was rhetorical. He also fell flat. Anger wasn't there, nor frustration, or even the small amount of hurt that he felt when the kid had told him he couldn't be saved. Annoyance was there, but that was easily hidden. Aizawa didn't need to go into detail about what he was thinking. I don't know. The answer didn't feel like enough. It showed on his face, and Izuku didn't offer any more. What you tried to do was probably the stupidest thing I've ever seen someone your age do. Aizawa started with a strict tone, normally reserved for parenting or scolding students that really fucked up, usually right before he expelled them. Why did you think it was logical? There weren't any options to go for. Izuku snapped back, his eyes narrowed slightly in his defense as he looked back at Aizawa. Regret suddenly replaced whatever emotion Izuku had, and he was back to holding and looking at his hands. There was too much happening. Hisashi was going to kill you, and I didn't want you to... And I didn't know what to do. So your death was the only rational thing you could think of. Izuku shrugged and looked at the floor. On the other side of the bed, Aizawa wasn't in his peripherals. Well, yeah. Aizawa's eyebrows raised, and the kid glanced at him, to the door, then back at his lap, hands now held tightly together. Sensei, he started. Why am I here? Hospitals heal, Aizawa sighed. The injuries you had were life-threatening. No, why am I here? The question was clear. Aizawa took a few minutes, trying to find the words to properly tell his kid that he didn't deserve to die, that he was a good kid if severely misguided, and was worth the effort of rescuing. Because I won't let you die. Not like that, and not to them. Izuku frowned. But I honestly don't care. Aizawa snapped back, silencing the kid, who now stared at him in surprise, leaving the floor to Aizawa to explain. I do not care for whatever bullshit that coward of a father fed you all your life. I don't care for the lies those executives tried to convince you of, and I don't care for the justifications they crammed into your head to explain what you've done. You are not worthless, not disposable, and you certainly are not useless. You are strong-willed, valued, and have full potential to improve as a person when given the right chances. I intend to give you those chances. That's why you're here. Izuku and Aizawa stared at each other for a few minutes, one in complete surprise and the other with a stone-cold determination. It was quiet for a while. Izuku eventually tore his eyes away to look back at his lap, and eventually anywhere that wasn't Aizawa's chair. Aizawa's phone buzzed, 10 quiet minutes later. He pulled it from his pocket, still somewhat unused to having it after months of leaving it in the apartment. A text from Hisashi lit up the screen, telling him he was on his way. Aizawa felt a tug on his lips as he stuffed the phone back in his pocket. President Mike is on his way now, he said. Izuku visibly tensed as he looked directly at the teacher. He's here for a casual visit, Aizawa continued. He's just about as worried about you as I was. You're in no danger around him. Izuku's shoulders relaxed slightly, his nervousness hidden by a new layer of genuine confusion and surprise. Izuku was expecting President Mike to be in costume when he showed up, with his gelled-up hair and the weird glasses and the crazy high-energy levels that he had in interviews or his radio show, like a weird bird he once saw on a morning news show, the many times that he stayed up way too late to watch late-night newscasts. One with the tall yellow feathers on its head and a loud squawk. Instead, a guy with blonde hair, tied half up, half down, and plain glasses walked in, with a distressed old backpack on, dressed in dark jeans, a t-shirt, and what looked like a pale gray cardigan, casually walking in after knocking on the doorframe and dropping the backpack on the ground next to Aizawa, turning to grin at Izuku. Hey, little listener, President Mike greeted. He carried that unmatchable energy level in his voice and body language alone, and his smile was bright and From what Izuku could tell, it didn't have a hidden meaning behind it. In short, present Mike was weird. The man's smile dulled only slightly when Izuku only kept staring at him. "You don't look like a bird," was really the only thing Izuku could think to say other than, "Who the fuck is this?" The former was probably more polite. Present Mike dramatically hid his open hand on his chest and faked being hurt. Izuku tilted his head at this. Mike smirked when he glanced back at Aizawa and stood up straight. His drama gone. Aizawa had a slight pull on his lips, so this could have been a good thing. "I'm not in costume today. Off duty. You can call me Yamada Hisashi." A second later he followed with, "That's with a za, not a sa." "I'm Izuku." Izuku hesitated for only a second as he remembered Rabbit wasn't his name anymore. Yamada grinned. "Pleasure to meet ya." Yamada glanced at Aizawa as he took the empty chair beside him, a devilish sort of grin over his face. "You know, this one's been worrying about you non-stop." Yamada suddenly wheezed out the last part of his sentence as Aizawa promptly elbowed his side of his chest with his still crossed arms, giving a sharp look to the blonde. "Ow!" Yamada whined, arms crossed to protect his chest and leaning slightly forward, as if that kept him out of Aizawa's line of fire. "What was that for?" "To get you to stop talking," was the simple answer, and Yamada frowned, and Aizawa stayed stoic. The blonde looked almost like a pouting child. "Shota, that's mean." "So is saying things that you aren't supposed to." "But it's true." Izuku put a hand over his mouth and made a muffled snort as he looked away from the two. When he glanced back, he saw two sets of eyes looking at him. The smirk he was hiding behind his hands disappeared, and his hands fell to his lap. "What?" Nothing. Izuku squinted at the two of them as Yamada dismissed the situation, letting quiet fill the room as Yamada busied himself on his phone, searching up something if the Google page reflected in his glasses said anything by it, and Aizawa looked around bored, as if he was waiting for something and it was taking forever to get there. Izuku ended up looking at the two more closely and noticed the ring on Aizawa's wedding finger. So he did have a family. It was nice to know that wasn't a lie. Then he noticed the matching ring on Yamada's hand. Eyebrows raised and his eyes looking between the rings, Izuku looked up at the two's faces, who were either ignoring his staring or not noticing it. Most likely the former. "Are you both married?" Izuku asked suddenly, and Aizawa looked over as Yamada sputtered and looked away from his phone. Izuku just kept a flat face. That was answer enough. If you asked him, just the look in Aizawa's eyes when he was called out as a racerhead. Aizawa didn't have that same face, but the question of how was there? Izuku held up his right hand. "Rings match." At the same time the two men looked at their rings, and Aizawa sighed. Yamada laughed. "Yeah, we officially got married a few years ago. Been together a lot longer, though." Izuku gave a soft smile, then squinted at Aizawa. "Wait, but you kicked his ass in Hosu." Yamada sputtered again, and Aizawa smirked. "Yeah, I did." "He didn't. I let him win," Yamada argued back. "Sure you did, Mike." The two went back and forth, Aizawa with an air of amusement, and Yamada with both amusement and annoyance. Izuku listened to them bicker, entertained by the whole thing. "Fine, whatever," Yamada mumbled, when he'd finally had enough. He sat back in his chair, arms crossed and pouting. The whole stance disappeared when his phone buzzed against the plastic of the chair and he picked it up. Aizawa leaned over his shoulder to read what looked like a text, a trace of a frown on his face. Before Izuku could ask any questions, there was a knock on the door. Izuku's eyes flew to the noise and found the nurse again. She smiled warmly at Izuku and then at the heroes. "Just checking in," she said while walking inside, checking the monitors and the IV drip. "So I didn't ask before, Midoriya-san, but how's your arm feeling?" she asked, glancing at the bandaged arm. Izuku didn't glance at it, but kept his eyes trained on her. "It still hurts." "Can you move it?" Her attention was now on his arm and not the monitors and people. Izuku curled his fingers and rolled his wrist slightly before relaxing it to rest in his lap. There was still a pain underneath, but it wasn't as violent as it was in the chair. "All right, there's some underlying nerve damage from the burns. A lot of damage was old. Do you know what could have caused it?" Izuku glanced around to look at anything but another person, the first time he actively took his eyes away from the nurse. He gave a dismissive shrug that said, "Yes, but I won't talk about it." She gave a hum that accepted the answer, but was still suspicious with disbelief. "Either way," she turned to Aizawa and Yamada, who sat watching expectantly. "Now that he's awake, we're able to do some more healing with the quirks, and without the major risks like he was when he was asleep. It's fully controlled and monitored, but you'll have to sign off on it." Some parents prefer natural healing, with regular medications and treatments over quirk-based healing. It's not suggested for a Midoriya-specific condition, but we'll agree with the quirk healing, Aizawa said as Yamada's face turned bright red. Izuku watched Yamada for a moment before looking back at her. She smiled, and then turned back to the heroes. This will also extend to healing his back and other arm, though some of the other injuries will scar, specifically his left arm and the nurse paused, unsure of how to phrase the next part of her sentence. The injuries along his spine. Aizawa nodded, in understanding, and glanced at Izuku again. Izuku then understood what exactly she was speaking about. He hid his frown with indifference. There will most likely be some minor issues after discharge, but with proper therapy they should improve over time. She spent another minute promising more information on the healing process with the doctor when they were available. There was a sudden influx of patients, and it was taking the attention of the doctors nearby. Then she swiftly left to go check on other patients. "Did she call us his parents?" Yamada asked after a moment of dragged-on silence. "Is that really what you focused on?" Aizawa sighed as he leaned back in his seat, having leaned as far forward as he could while she was explaining things. "Well, no." Izuku took to turning his left hand over with his right and looking over his bandages, giving him at least something to do. Nothing happened for a little bit. Bored, probably out of his mind, Yamada managed to convince Izuku to turn on the small TV. It landed on a channel popular for rerunning hero interviews, specials on heroes, and old talk shows. Izuku watched it strictly in the past for the interviews, not the talk show bits that were at least somewhat normal. Not at all. Izuku found himself paying more attention to the TV than his hands. Same with Yamada, while Aizawa had his eyes closed, either napping or listening. Yamada, with permission, even moved his chair to the other side of Izuku's bed for a better spot, sitting quietly with his elbows on the armrest and fingers bridged across. Chair pushed back so he wouldn't be in the way of any nurses that might have needed to come through. The silence wasn't bad, though. It was nice. Of course, the news broke it. It was breaking news, and Genium catching some of the few dire members that had slipped through the cracks. There apparently weren't many left out there, which was comforting to a degree. Izuku asked a question that had been somewhat stuck in his mind after Hosu. "Was Ingenium really all right after that fight?" Aizawa shared a look with Yamada as the story changed. Izuku looked at the blonde, expecting to see a worried face or something to show that he was going to lie. Instead, he saw something casual and almost relieved. "Yeah, some healing and some bed rest, and he was fine. It was a little scar, nothing more than that. Can't say the same for his armor, though. Had to give it completely remade. Gave him an excuse to upgrade his things, so he didn't complain too much." Izuku gave a simple one-note hum as an answer. A while later, sometime in the afternoon, a doctor, a woman with dark purple hair and large round glasses, had come in. She introduced herself and, after giving Aizawa a packet of papers to look through, started talking a bit more about the healing quirks and their various side effects, most of which were drowsiness or nausea. She continued by explaining the 4 days which the process would take place and how slowly they would have to heal him in order to make sure they could fix as much as possible and not miss anything that could be a problem down the road, what to expect after, ranging from lots of naps to fever depending on which person on the staff was around that time, and what could be abnormal reactions to a quirk that sounded more like a standard warning than a common issue. The extent they went to explaining had Izuku somewhat conflicted, and he wasn't really quite sure why. Maybe it was because of a full healing that they were working toward, or just explaining a process before it was done to him, not just sitting him down and doing their job without a word directed at him. Sometime before dinner, Yamada and Aizawa had left for the night, a hero being posted outside the door as a guard. Whether it was to keep the wrong people from getting in or him from getting out, he didn't care. The hospital food wasn't terrible, a surprise considering how many people had been seen on social media complaining about it. All in all, not bad for his first day back in the land of the living. The next day was slow and calm. Izuku had woken up knowing where he was. Panic on that front wasn't the issue. His brain dulled with medications after he ate. The healing process had began. Every 4 hours someone would come in and spend 5 minutes slowly healing the damage, though it was fairly uncomfortable on Izuku's part. Hands either holding his arm, hovering over his back or knee, always warm and light, and wary of the green eyes that never really left them as they worked. There were 2 that he saw the most. One older woman, Izuku knew her as Recovery Girl, who would simply come in, check how the healing was working on his arms, kiss the back of his hand and leave after telling him to rest. She came once every day. The other was a kind-faced man in his early 40s named John, some transfer foreigner now living in the city for his own reasons, who normally worked on Izuku's back and shoulder when he chatted about various things. Sometimes he would talk about exactly what he was doing, and that seemed to put Izuku a bit at ease. His quirk side effects were dizziness if used too long on one person. Izuku ended up just sleeping that off. Aizawa dropped by for 2 hours before he was called in for work. Hero work, probably. They started to lower the pain medications in small increments, which was both good and bad. Good because he could get all of his head clear, and bad because he could feel the aches of things that were not yet healed. He could handle it, though. It was fine. The day after that moved in much the same fashion until 2 in the afternoon, right after Izuku woke up from a nap caused by Recovery Girl. He was still rubbing sleep from his eyes as they walked in, Yamada hiding something under indifference and an energetic smile. Aizawa somehow was easier to read, though, through his neutral expression. This wasn't an entirely casual visit. "You look tired, Sensei," Izuku said around a yawn. He hated this groggy feeling, but his arms were getting better. A lose-win. Aizawa shrugged. "So do you." Aizawa sat down as Izuku didn't answer. "How are you feeling, kid?" Yamada asked as he took the chair that he left the other day. Izuku rolled his shoulders and then lifted his arms slightly, opening and closing his hands a few times. "It's been a few sessions, but my arms are feeling a little better." Aizawa nodded, and something beyond the door took his eyes for only a moment. The hero on guard duty was on a break. Once the 2 pros had walked in, there shouldn't be anyone out there to get his attention. Izuku glanced at the curtains, half-foot of empty space at the bottom of the very glass wall, seeing the shadow of shoes on the very edge of what he was able to see through it. "What's wrong?" Izuku didn't sound curious. He was saying it like Aizawa knew something and he had to know. Aizawa nodded, presumably at the person outside, and then he shook his head slightly. One person walked in while another pair of shoes waited right beside the door. Just waiting. The person who walked in was wearing a long brown coat over a suit and removing his hat as he walked in. Black hair, plain eyes. He stood, reserved to a certain degree, in front of the framed glass board. "Hello," the stranger greeted. "I'm Detective Tsukauchi Namasa. I was the one running in Racerhead's mission that he had for the Silver Dyer." Izuku wiped his moment of surprise off his face and nodded. Tsukauchi gave a reserved smile. "I have a few questions to ask you about the Silver Dyer and your time under their influence, if that's all right with you." Izuku fought the urge to mess with his hands again. Instead, he was silently nodding, and he kept his hands still in his lap. Tsukauchi took a small pad of paper and a pen from his coat pocket. Izuku did his best to not stare at the detective, but to not let his eyes off him either, much like he'd done with everyone else who came to help him, with very few exceptions. "You were the rabbit assassin, correct?" Tsukauchi started. Izuku did his best to show the question did not faze him. As far as he knew, it worked. "Yes?" "And how long have you worked as rabbit?" Izuku furrowed his eyebrows. "I'm not sure." Tsukauchi took only a second to write something down. "When was your first interaction with Silver Dyer?" "When I was 6. "And what happened?" "Hisashi broke into the apartment with a few other people, and I guess he kidnapped me. I think they hurt my mom. I don't remember a whole lot." "Have you ever willingly followed Midori Hisashi's orders?" Izuku raised an eyebrow and asked, "Are you asking if I wanted to, or if I had to?" "Wanted." "No." "All right." Tsukauchi wrote again and looked up at Izuku. "Were you an active member of the group?" Izuku thought for a moment. In technicality, an assassin like that he was, but something told him the detective was asking about the executives. "Are you asking about as an executive or as an assassin?" "Executive." "Oh, then, informally, yes. Can you elaborate on that?" Aizawa was watching the detective, and Izuku could feel Yamada watching him. The person that was outside was listening in too, Izuku could tell. He gave in and started fiddling with his hands. "Well, Hisashi, he didn't want me interacting with people, probably to avoid a situation like with Sensei. Most members avoided executives, and making me one was a way to sort of, I don't know, divide from a majority, alienate. I didn't have any power to do anything in the group like Cora and the other executives did, but people outside that loop knew nothing of how they worked." Tsukauchi took a few minutes to write something out and then frowned. "We interviewed a few Silver Dyer members. Most said they didn't know you were a minor or your actual name. Can you explain why?" Well, most people and Hisashi called me Rabbit. Hisashi refused to call me by name when in front of other people or specific executives that worked in the main base. He only really called me by it when we were on our own or he was angry because I did something stupid again. And age doesn't matter when no one asks, and it's hard to answer that question when you don't know how to answer it to begin with. Izuku saw a shift in the person outside. Tsukauchi nodded. Define something stupid. What do you mean by that? Izuku raised an eyebrow only a bit, but his face fell neutral after a second. Like not following Hisashi's rules. Which were? At this, Izuku openly frowned. I don't know. They were kinda everywhere, for the most part. So they were vague. Tsukauchi went to write another thing down. Izuku was wondering exactly what was going into that notebook. More like undefined, Izuku said, almost warily. There was a few things I knew not to do, but others I didn't understand. I'd do one thing, it'd be beneficial sometimes, and he wouldn't do anything. I did it again, even if it was beneficial a second time, and he'd get angry. It was kind of like with what happened after I fought Aizawa and Yamada at the mall. Yamada and Aizawa both perked up. Tsukauchi was nodding. After the nightclub murder. Izuku rolled his shoulders. Yeah. And what did he do? Well, he did nothing. Eyebrows went up. Which is weird. Normally he gets pissed off and yells or throws something or breathes fire or is completely silent. I'm not supposed to fight heroes. It's normally why I disengage whenever I'm confronted, and he knows when I do, because cameras are always on heroes. If I end up on one, Hisashi knows by the time I get my report back to him. By the time I get back to the base, but after the mall, Hisashi, he didn't do anything. Which I'm thankful for, because I was fucked up after that fight, but it was weird. Really? Yamada asked, eyes wide. Aizawa shot him a strained look, between a glare and relief. Izuku gave an affirming shrug. He warned me, that's all, of the consequences for doing it again, and told me to get back to work. There was a quiet interrupted by the scratching of pen on paper. For curiosity's sake, what was the next hero fight after that? Izuku thought for only a moment. He asked for a fight, not a talk, so after All Might and Kamui it would have to be Hosu, I think. But everything he did after that wasn't just because of the hero fight. It really was my fault. Another shift outside and a look from Aizawa. Tsukauchi's expression slightly pressed for more, and Izuku shifted and obliged. The target set up protection in his apartment. It's my job to pick up on these things. I didn't see it coming until it was too late, and the uncertainty of the, outcome of the original task until it was reported. And that huge fight with Ingenium and Present Mike and Manuel, it was a real mess. Why was he the target? Oh, he was an informant for a hero group in Hosu, ratted out a black market weapons ring that Hisashi had been checking into. Some of his contacts were killed when heroes went to dismantle it. They were in his main connectors for this really underground Yakuza group that popped up on his radar a few months ago. Had something Hisashi wanted. Yakuza, you mentioned it in the recordings. Do you know more? Izuku raised his eyebrows and immediately looked at Aizawa. Recordings? The watch, was the teacher's answer. Izuku nodded his understanding and looked back at the detective. I don't know much. They were pretty small and only experimental. Something about quirks. Hisashi was fascinated with them. I'm sure you could have guessed that much. Izuku gave a small nervous laugh as his eyes went down to his hands. I don't know names, and I barely recall faces. What exactly do you recall? I don't know, masks? I only saw pictures during a report to Hisashi, nothing else. What about Phase 1? What about it? Izuku asked as he scrunched up his nose. How much do you know? I only knew what they told me. Overthrow people, reap havoc, kill. My job was supposed to be to take out some politician, but they could have been keeping my actual orders under wraps until the time came. Wouldn't be the first time they've done something like that for a big operation. Lessens the chance of high-profile information getting out just in case anyone plants moles. I'm not really allowed to know anything that they do, either. You know all this how? I stood in for meetings, sometimes, in the back in case negotiators tried something underhanded, like a security guard, It's how I learned that Hisashi was going to take out Aizawa before Phase 1 launched. Yamada looked uncomfortable hearing that. Then you stole information and leaked it right after? Correct. Tsukauchi closed his notepad and sighed, stuffing it in his pocket along with his pen. He pulled out a small plastic bag sealed with red tape and labeled it as evidence. Inside was another smaller bag holding 2 small box shapes. The prongs on the side were supposed to be silver. They were brown instead. Dried. These were found in your neck, and similar ones were found with several others that were locked in the lower floors. Do you know what they are exactly?" "The green one is the shock box. The black one is new." "A shock box," Tsukauchi confirmed, and Izuku nodded. "Standard. What did the other one do?" At this, Izuku leaned back in the propped-up head of his bed. "Yukio, right before I was locked up, said something about me being the first to try it after they got it from a new connection, probably that Yakuza group. It's a suppressant of some kind. It worked really fast." "At what?" Tsukauchi put the bag back in his pocket. It stopped my quirks." Eyebrows went up and faces contorted in confusion. Izuku glanced at the curtain by the window as a bird flew past it. It was honestly terrifying. It started wearing off not long before I was found." Tsukauchi stood there, processing the new information for a good minute. "That's more than I anticipated, but it's good. Good information. Thank you for your time, Midoriya-san." With that, Tsukauchi gave a short bow and he took his leave. Izuku relaxed his shoulders slightly once he left. Aizawa didn't really know what to make of the new information. He wasn't expecting Izuku to give that much right away, but the kid did still look groggy. Perhaps some of the medications the doctor was slowly weaning off of him. His attempts at hiding his expressions faltered only a few times during the interrogation. Izuku relaxed as the detective had left, only to tense up again as there was a knock on the door. Tensei stood there. He had some sort of smile, but Aizawa could tell he was conflicted. Why the hero insisted on listening in, and why Tsukauchi allowed for him? They were unanswered questions, but he was staying after. Tensei gave a nervous wave. "Hiya," he greeted. Izuku stared at him blankly, probably trying to read the hero's intentions. Tensei looked to Aizawa for help, and Aizawa just shrugged, and he watched, and he was finding it somewhat amusing. Tensei slowly walked in and stood next to Hizashi's chair, Hizashi who was now staring at his phone. "Start with an introduction," Hizashi stage whispered, after another awkward moment of silence. "I'm Ida Tensei." Izuku seemed to calm for only a second before sitting up straight. "Ingenium." Tensei laughed awkwardly at this, and he rubbed the back of his neck. "In the flesh, it's nice to meet you, Tensei was pretending to not know Izuku's name, probably trying to use it as a bridge for conversation. "Izuku." "Izuku, nice." Tensei let the words fall out, and it was all he could say when something interrupted Izuku almost too quickly. "I'm sorry about Hosu." Tensei's strange arrow eyebrows rose, and his laughter was nervous. "It's not something to apologize for, kiddo. I... Tensei stopped, his standard response to an apology, unsure of how to answer this, almost like how he couldn't find the response Aizawa gave for the situation. But Tensei couldn't storm out because of his conflicting heroic side and sympathy towards anyone who could possibly remind him of Tenya. It got quiet, and Tensei kept looking around for words in the walls. Understanding crossed Izuku's face. "I have a brother your age, you know," Tensei said after a moment, looking back at Izuku, who had tilted his head slightly. "Shinso's about your age, too. You guys might get along." Other than the tilted head expression, Izuku had no visible response. "Who's Shinso?" "Oh, that's our son!" Hizashi piped up with a wide grin. Interest settled into Izuku's face as Tensei and Hizashi jumped into a vague explanation of the kids. Aizawa got up not long after and left the room to find the doctor and get an actual read on Izuku's recovery, Hizashi following after and leaving Tensei and Izuku to talk. Izuku's recovery was going better than expected and was on track. The two were relieved by the news and started to head back. On the way to the room, Aizawa spotted two people looking lost in the hallway. He made eye contact with the shorter of the two, looking into eyes filled with a want for relief and a surprise surplus of hope, worry, anxiousness, and guilt. Aizawa offered a small smile as a sort of comfort, and a late apology. Aizawa called Tensei away in the middle of the two's conversation, which switched from asking about Tensei's quirk to his work to how well he knew Aizawa, about Tenya, to quirk theory. All in all, Izuku was having a pretty fluid conversation with someone he fought, and it was actually nice while it lasted. Tensei gave a departing remark. Aizawa just gave Izuku a comforting look and practically dragged Tensei away, Yamada bidding him good night and leaving, voice trailing off with the other two, leaving Izuku on his own, not really knowing why. And then another guest knocked on the doorframe, soft and hesitant, and, as cliché and as stupid as he knows it sounded, the world froze, throwing everything into pause for minutes that felt like hours. And it was a moment Izuku always used to think about when he was younger, before the deal and the rabbit and every shitty thing he'd done. When all that good was possible, then it became impossible. He fought so hard for even the smallest chance of it happening and throwing it away, and now it was real. It didn't feel real. It didn't feel like he was actually alive and awake and sitting in a hospital bed, locked in a staring contest with his mother. Inko hadn't changed much. She was somewhat shorter and a bit stout, but then again Izuku had grown up too. Her hair was half up, half down, and almost frazzled looking, like she hadn't gotten a decent night's rest in a while and didn't have the effort to brush it off completely. Worry and relief sitting in watering eyes as her hands were moving from the doorframe to cover her mouth. And then the air came back to the both of them. The world moved again, and there they still stood, at least Inko did, until Izuku said a quiet and broken, "Hi, Mom." Inko, now openly in tears, crossed the room and immediately pulled her son into a gentle but enveloping hug. Izuku noticed his own eyes spilling over, but it was far from sad, and for the first time in a very long time, Izuku carefully buried his head in her shoulder and hugged his mother back. 10 minutes after the crying had quietly settled down, there was soft talking. It was Inko speaking softly, comfortingly to Izuku, her boy. Toshinori was waiting in the hall, just out of view of the doorway and the glass wall. He didn't know what to expect when it came to meeting this mystery boy, especially after Tsukauchi and Aizawa's explanation of him. Toshinori had seen photos of the boy when he was super small, young, but that was it. This 14-year-old boy who'd gone through his own version of hell. The hero stole himself and took a single step toward the door, but stopped. He couldn't intrude on this. Inko had been waiting for 9 years to see Izuku again, and Toshinori had never met him before. He could wait longer to meet his stepson. He stayed in the hall until Inko was kindly asked to leave by a nurse. He had a healing session that would put him asleep for a few hours after. Here Inko promised to return tomorrow before she left, eyes red and smile brighter than it had been in the last week, maybe even brighter. Inko left and was fairly reluctant to do so. Izuku could have sworn there was someone waiting outside, either for Inko or for him, probably for her. He didn't know anyone except for the few who had been in his room since he woke up. A few healing sessions left that day and dinner, then he was out like a light for the night, feeling better than when he first woke up, finally able to roll onto his side and not have to hurt. "Huh?" Izuku made a questioning noise when, at 5 a.m. the next morning, his nurse had said that he was going to be moved to a more general room, a nicer one outside of the ICU, but still within the hero ward boundaries. Most of his injuries were healed, medications were at a very low amount, and he wasn't in an intense state as when he arrived. "It's where you'll finish the healing and rest for another day before you're discharged," she had said with a kind smile, and then Izuku was swiftly moved out. The new room slightly larger. There was an actual solid wall and a bathroom. Walls painted a light tan and the tiles unchanged. Only the view from his window had shifted down half a block. He was even allowed to leave the bed if he so chose, as long as he didn't leave the room unattended. The hero guard was still posted outside his door as a just-in-case. Standing on his own was a feat by itself, with a nurse watching him, ready if he fell, as he actually stood up. Barefoot on cold tile, his knees shook a little, and he was unsteady at first, but his balance returned quick enough. Accompanied by a no pain in his once-injured knee, no limp when he took steps forward, the new nurse, the one named Toko, had smiled at him for the accomplishment, which was strange, yes, but not unwelcome. The sun was high, later that same day, and Izuku sat cross-legged on the bed looking through a magazine that he'd been given. Aizawa walked in carrying a subtle, smug air with him as Yamada followed, looking energetic. Izuku squinted at them when he looked up from the magazine. Aizawa's expression wasn't comforting. Why was he smug, of all things? Whoa, kid, are you all right?" Yamada cut himself off quickly, and Izuku tilted his head in question. "Yeah? Why?" "You look exhausted," Aizawa commented while dropping himself into a plastic chair, arms crossed. "Almost as bad as Shota." Yamada laughed when Aizawa gave him a look. Izuku shrugged and went back to the magazine. "What you reading, kiddo?" Yamada walked to the side of the bed and looked at the page Izuku was reading. The frown that replaced curiosity didn't go unnoticed. Aizawa raised an eyebrow from his seat. The article in question was run the day before about the raids, more specifically about the high-profile arrests during it, of which Izuku's name and Rabbit's alias was a part of. No image was attached to this one, but his name was still there. It said he was 14. Did that mean his guess was right? The current paragraph, along with most of the article, was about Hisashi and his date for court. "Who gave you this?" Yamada asked, distaste in his tone, but he didn't move to grab it, which was good. Izuku glanced at him and backed down at the page. "The nurse. I think they gave me the first thing they could think of, so I wouldn't be bored." Yamada sighed and moved a seat to sit in a similar place that he had in the ICU. Sitting down, his energy somewhat lowered, Izuku stared at the page and the printed-over court date. 2 days. He had 2 days until he was sentenced. He was going to come out guilty, maybe with a life sentence at best. He didn't have any hero moles or bribed cops to get him out of this mess. Hisashi was fucked. When's my court date? Izuku asked the silence. Aizawa frowned and Yamada did too. Izuku didn't look up. I mean, a lot of members are getting them for even minor involvement. I'm far from an outlier. Aizawa sighed. Izuku huffed a soft laugh. Prison that hard to get into? Izuku, you're not getting a court date, and you're not going to prison. Aizawa had a finality to his tone. Izuku frowned this time. I'm not following. The teacher leaned forward and shifted his arms to explain. We have everything settled. A testimony against him in your favor. Izashi's fucked when it comes to stand. Yamada had interrupted with a grin when Aizawa briefly glared before continuing, moving a chair to the end of the bed before standing with his arms crossed next to it as he continued. And we've developed a program to help. A program? Izuku asked, genuinely surprised. Was he going to be thrown into an AA-style meeting with young, troubled ex-assassins? Yeah, Yamada chimed in, energy now completely returned. Nezu finalized it, and it went through last night. Oh? Izuku took a minute to really process what was said. Wait, Nezu, as in UA Principal Nezu? That's right. A chirp, new voice, and a small white thing jumped onto the chair Aizawa had moved from. Izuku jumped, as was fully prepared to throw the magazine at it as well. I'm Nezu. Nice to meet you, Midoriya-san. It greeted with what looked like a grin. How the fuck did Izuku not see him come in? Izuku stared at the bear, dog, mouse thing for a moment. The hero took about a quarter of a page in one of his notebooks. Information on him was fairly limited. When Izuku didn't answer right away, Nezu just kept talking in an upbeat tone. I'm the principal of UA, and Eraserhead's employer. Tsukauchi-san and Aizawa both informed me of your situation, and I feel inclined to help. Nezu moved so his hands were behind his back, standing a little taller. You and your mother aren't out of danger completely, correct? No, I think some of Hisashi's contacts could be angry that the Dyer's gone. Nezu nodded. Needless to say, it's not smart to jail you for the damage that you've been forced to cause, and with your past, it's unwise to let you attempt a casual civilian life. So I've come up with a middle ground. With the approval of the school board, the teachers, and the police, UA is starting the first villain rehabilitation program. Rehabilitation? Izuku echoed softly, almost trying to confirm if he heard that word right. Nezu nodded. Yes, with your public image slandered and with the release of your rabbit alias and name, it threatens any move that you make going forward. Additionally, you need the safety to develop. UA is a safer place to continue in education and reform your learned abilities to match closer to a hero's agenda. It's a win-win. Izuku simply stared and then glanced at Aizawa. Aizawa was still smug, but not as much as before. He nodded at him. Izuku glanced at Yamada and got an encouraging smile as a response. Izuku rolled his shoulders, now mostly pain-free, and bridged his fingers. Why? The single word brought a new air into the room. Nezu seemed to get a question across his face, but he didn't frown. Aizawa did, however, almost like he expected this. What do you mean, kid? Izuku shrugged at Aizawa and glanced around. I mean, heroes are good people, and everyone who's gotten into UA actually deserves it. They worked for it. Getting in isn't easy. I'm not a good person. I don't want to take the spot of someone who would have worked hard to be there. This time Nezu's smile disappeared. Silence hung for a moment, besides the tension. While you may not think that you're a good person, you're not exactly a bad person either, Midoriya-san. Izuku looked at the principal incredulously. There's chances to grow. You're still young. You're a hero in some ways, and in some of your past actions it shows. We want to support it. Izuku shifted to move and hold his loosely balled-up left hand in his right. A bad person would have let me die, Aizawa said after a moment. Izuku looked at him immediately. Or let that kid die in the sludge villain incident. Or they wouldn't have spent so long protecting someone and risk all of it, for complete strangers. You've ended lives in the past, that's true, we can't forget that, but you've had time to outweigh it by saving more lives than you've taken. Izuku stared and glanced around the room, at the people inside, now twisting part of the blanket in fists, moving his hand that had been unbandaged, his right arm now completely free and left still covered. What was visible of it covered in small scars that crisscrossed his fingers. Yamada had a mixture of a frown that turned into a gentle smile, with a glance and a nod from Aizawa. It turned into a wide and encouraging grin. Nezu was indifferent in expression after his speech. Aizawa's support was undeniable, but the soft smile made it even more. Izuku looked down at his hands again, took in a deep breath, and looked up at the three teachers staring back. Okay. All right, everyone, this concludes Research to Rescue. I hope you guys enjoyed this fic. The author has started a second fic to follow this one up in the Dire Circumstance series that they did, but it's not completed, so until it is, I won't be continuing this series, but I hope you guys really did enjoy, and as always, thank you so much for listening.